Thanks so much for coming. I'm just going to talk for about 20 minutes. It's not going to be 45 minutes, as it's in the program. It's too long and boring. And then I hope we can discuss a little bit more about what I had to say about markets. And can markets work in education? I mean, the title is just ridiculous. So there are theoretical arguments for why it would work, and there are also some challenges that we need to address, I think, in order to make that persuasive case that it can work. And I will focus more on the challenges than the potential, because the potential is quite well researched and established. So let's begin. Just briefly on the theory of why it would work. Well, one thing, why you would have choice. If you have choice, you might allow better matching between pupil and school. This better matching might arguably lead to better achievement. You might also find that autonomous or private schools might be better than regular state schools that don't have autonomy. They can respond to pupils' needs better, perhaps, and so on and so forth. And the result will be that there's a better outcomes for kids. The final mechanism is competition, but of course that's dependent on choice as well as school autonomy. If you don't have choice, there is no competition, and you don't need to compete. And if there's no school autonomy, there's very little, very few ways that you can compete with, or mechanisms, or tools. So the idea is that poorly performing schools improve or go out of business, and then high performing schools expand. Very good. So the idea then is that this will raise efficiency, higher quality per pound spent. So you get either better quality, lower costs, or both, right? So the main idea here is that markets in education work pretty much like in other sectors, and I think that they don't necessarily do that for various reasons. And the first is that in education we most like to talk about quasi-markets. A quasi-market is not a regular market where you have price competition. So you have competition autonomy with third-party payments, first of all, so someone else is paying for you to go to school, and you also have price floors and most often ceilings. And since there is no price mechanism, at least if you don't have top-up fees in theory, there is no simple aggregation of local information, which is one of the great strengths, or supposed strengths at least, of markets, right? So there's very little way of how parents can know which schools are the best, which schools are, at least in the regular kind of market narrative. But even if there is a price mechanism, education quality is quite complex, and information asymmetries between producers and consumers are quite considerable. Education quality is not just like eating a chocolate and thinking that this tastes good, right? You spit it out. I mean, Schumpeter actually used pedagogy as an example of why politics was different. They said, the picture of the prettiest girl that ever lived will in the long run prove powerless in maintaining the sales of a bad cigarette. The same cannot be said in political or educational decisions, because it takes time, right? It's very difficult to know, are we talking about quality? Are we talking about educational quality? Are we talking about value added? How can parents even observe this, right? That's one of the issues. And economic theory also suggests that in markets where it's difficult to understand, identify, and contract quality, competition may not actually lead to better results. And there's been some ways. So schools may obviously build reputation, which is the main idea here, that by providing a good education, you build a good reputation, and you get more kids as a result. But if they find easier ways to build reputation, increasing quality is probably expensive and it's quite difficult. If you find easier ways to do it, you might do that instead. For example, taking the best kids, pretending that you're a good school. Okay. Also important why we talk about education slightly differently. Well, there are positive externalities, also uncertain returns among parents on how much they should invest in education, which do tend to justify, or many people say that it justifies, some government funding to avoid underinvestment in education. And that's one of the, Hawksby I cite there just because it's what has been one of the greatest proponents of choice, but she's definitely acknowledging this issue, why it is different. So they are different, and we need to establish that. When it comes to the empirical literature, as James mentioned, I wrote a book on the impact, or looking at the literature. What's the theory of why it occurs? How do we make it work? What conditions need to prevail for choice to work? But I also surveyed the empirical literature from all over the world. Overall, that literature finds kind of mixed effects, but generally small to moderate positive effects. I've just highlighted one case here. I'm from Sweden, so we do have a voucher system, or similar to the free school system. We have for-profit schools as well, instead of just having non-profit schools as your free schools. It's much easier to set them up. So the supply side is slightly different than here. But there is a paper that was recently published in Economica, and it finds, not only finding positive effects on grades. We have a problem in Sweden. We don't really have reliable grades. They're not standardized, right? So teachers give them, and there's no accountability to how they should grade kids. But in the recent paper, they actually look at TIMSS results as well, long-term effects, and this is just an easy extrapolation of what Sweden's results in 2011 when I extrapolated from actual to no increase. So the actual increase is how the percentage of, or the increase in the percentage of kids who attend free schools, right? No increase is the counterfactual, and it's just slightly higher, but it's higher, it's not lower. So this doesn't mean that, I mean, many people think, because Sweden, of course, I'm just mentioning Sweden again because it's a good example of this, that Sweden has, of course, fallen in PISA, right, and in TIMSS, despite the fact that free schools are going up. And this is so the media latch on to that, and they say, okay, it's obviously free schools. We have people in Sweden saying the same thing. There's no evidence for this. And of course, but it is quite intriguing that the OECD, who advises the government, here advises every government on how to improve their education systems, they don't really seem to understand the difference between correlation and causation. So I'm not surprised that the media don't often. And of course the media story is good, even if it's a correlation. But the OECD tends to, in its fourth report of the PISA report, fourth chapter, they have these correlations up and down, left and right. And they said there is no evidence of private school competition leading to better effects. Now, the education economists have evaluated whether higher percentage of kids in private schools, or privately operated schools, can be publicly funded, can be privately funded, lead to better PISA scores, and it does. It shows that the methods that the OECD uses are crap. Yeah? So just as to show this issue that obviously many other things are going on in Sweden, so we find positive effects in Sweden. Many other things are going on in Sweden. This summer, I just calculated the impact of immigration. And as you can see here, the blue line here is the average PISA score trajectory for kids with fully Swedish background. The other one is for all of them. You can see that the gap between them increased substantially between 2000 and 2012. It's about 30% of the fall in PISA can mechanically be explained by immigration. But you haven't heard that much, have you, about that? But nevertheless, we're talking in the literature and in the study of the Swedish market, in any study of education market, we're talking about quite flawed quasi-markets. I mean, all education markets are considered problems. I say in Sweden, we have, first of all, an insane mismatch between centralization and decentralization. So we give a lot of autonomy to schools to mark and give grades to their kids without any accountability of what these grades mean. At the same time as we force both universities and high schools, upper secondary school, to accept pupils based solely on those grades, as well as we're introducing competition and choice. I mean, it's quite remarkable that the evidence finds any positive effects in the current Swedish framework, but it's very flawed. Same thing in Chile, where there actually is less evidence of positive effects. Chile has school selection, has had school selection, no more, but also top-ups. And based on what I argued, if it's difficult, if you allow selection, for example, it might be easier to just compete by cream skimming, and some people have posed that as an alternative, well, as an explanation for why the evidence is positive in Sweden, but not in Chile, necessarily. So the point is there. In England, we can talk about that before. I mean, comparative is actually good on information. So unlike Sweden, because we don't have any proper standardized scores, we don't really have any good information. It's actually rational it's turned out to choose a bad school in Sweden because the likelihood is that you get higher grades given your ability because you're surrounded by lower achieving kids. So the teachers will think that you're better than you are. Now, you do have much better information here, but there is, I mean, Philip mentioned a little bit on the supply side, it's a much less dynamic market. Free schools, sure, they're increasing, but we'll see it's not We will see how that pans out, but it has been quite poor historically, and I'm not sure if the free school program will do anything about that. Tie-break device, I mean, this is a problem anywhere in the world, but the tie-break device that we use when we assign kids to decide who should go to the oversubscribed schools is the proximity house. So the good schools become full, and then the mortgage, who has the mortgage close to school, will inevitably become very important. And that inhibits choice for the less well-off, and perhaps equity as well. So there's just a couple of examples, but if you look all over the world, they're quite poorly designed systems. Right? Turns out it's been very difficult to implement what is necessary for these education markets to function very well. And the question is now, how can we make them better? And if so, how? And also, I think it's important here to discuss a little bit about the ideal type. Of course, there are no ideal type education markets where you have no government funding, you have no regulation. The closest to those types of markets are in the developing world. For example, in India, we have a lot of low-cost private schools popping up everywhere, small mom-and-pop stores. Now, they also are dependent on government funding, even though very few want to acknowledge it. They hire very young teachers who've been women mostly, in Pakistan and India, who have been educated in government secondary schools. And it is quite interesting that these low-cost private schools have mostly emerged at the primary school level. And World Bank researchers have done analysis of this, finding that the likelihood, indeed, that private schools pop up is much higher where there is a government secondary school. Because so they piggyback on government investments in education. So even these markets are not entirely free from intervention or government funding. So, and also, we don't really have much evidence on how they work, but I say there are questions about even the ideal type of education markets, because of information asymmetries, because of the different way in which the price mechanism might work in education, the differences in terms of how we understand quality. There are good arguments to say that it might not be the same as in other types of markets. So, the issues, and I think some of the things that we will be discussing in the panels today is the idea that some people say there's a mismatch between private and public interest. Is that the reason why the evidence is not stronger in favor of like large effects? Probably not, but some people would say that parents care more about pupil satisfaction and happiness rather than academic quality. In England, I don't buy that. In Sweden, I certainly buy it to a certain extent, which is an issue. But so the question is then, do parents value quality? What quality? Can we nudge them with certain information to make sure that they choose schools based on the quality we would like them to be? Do poor parents value quality as much as rich parents, etc., etc.? There are many questions there. Free entry and exit is one of those conditions to the education market. It's one of those conditions that we would like to establish in the ideal, but it's very difficult to maintain. Of course, we have government funding. Inevitably, we will have regulation on which schools can come in. And there are difficulties in closing down poorly performing schools. Every time you have a school closing, that is shit. You will have parents picketing outside, demonstrating we want the school and sending letters to MPs, etc. It's very difficult, but these schools have to go if the market should function as it should. Or they have to improve, but if they don't improve, they have to go. And the question is, can we achieve this, and if so, how? Another issue on the flip side, on the other side of the coin here is how do we incentivize the good schools to expand? That's also been increasingly difficult. It's been very difficult to see that the good schools in England expand as a result of being, as a result of being good. Instead, they do become oversubscribed, and they use the tie-break device, most often the case, proximity. So overall, actually, there was a couple of researchers in Barcelona looking at the change in catchment areas. And it turns out that parents do game the system. They do realize which schools are available to them, also based on proximity. So at the end, when they do this theoretical analysis, it looks like the schools, basically there's very little difference when you allow choice compared to a situation with residential choice. Because you get into the same schools anyway because of the tie-break device, right? And then the question is, what information should be provided and by whom? I mentioned the information issue. How can we decrease these information asymmetries? How can we know that a school that has high scores also is a school that is effective in raising children's scores? We do have value added. There are problems with these metrics. They're improving, but there are certainly other things as well that schools probably should focus on, right? And how do we ensure the right amount of state accountability? Because, on the one hand, if you have no accountability, it might become more like Sweden. It is very difficult in this market's work. If you have too much accountability, you will constrain and stifle competition. You will stifle choice as well. There's very little to choose from. So the question is, how will you make those education markets work? If there's too much accountability or too little accountability. So the conclusion here is just very simple. There are theoretical reasons to believe that market incentives may improve educational efficiency. There are also theoretical reasons to believe that market incentives in education might work slightly different. They're a bit more complicated, and that applies both to quasi and not quasi-education market. And I argue here that, of course, in the book I argue that as well, that design is key. You need to think about how we design these systems so the incentives are right, and the incentives are aligned to improve pupil performance, that everybody's driving in the right direction. This is almost a trivial point, I give you that. Design matters, okay? But how do we do it? Well, I have my own ideas, and I probably might raise some of those ideas during the day, and also some of them are in the book. But I think part of the discussion here and the conference today, or the idea behind the conference, is to kind of look at that. So I just, again, recap the evidence. The evidence indicates small to moderate effects, but again, these small to moderate effects are quite intriguing because most of the systems out there are really bad. So the question is, how can we make education markets function better? Let's discuss, and I'll stop there, and then I'll invite you to contribute to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Hi, the focus seems to always be on school quality. There's a lot of evidence accumulating that shows that actually a lot of the variation is actually at the teacher level, and that there might be one excellent teacher within a school, and in the current system, with the current metrics, actually maybe the school doesn't even know they have an excellent teacher that is really making a difference to children, and definitely the parents don't. So my question is, how does the teacher level variation actually feed into school markets, and how do you design the market so that the mechanisms favour information about teacher level variation in quality?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, teachers, yes. I mean, you could argue that you should release, for example, value added of teachers. They've done that in Los Angeles. So they produce every single teacher level, the value added of a teacher. They provide that publicly. That's one argument. On the other hand, you don't choose teachers, do you? You might make a preference for a teacher. In America, not in Sweden, I think. No. But you might, anyway. But it's going to be difficult. You could make the argument you should also, within the school, allow for choice teachers. And how do you allocate the kids who can't go to the same teachers? I wouldn't know. I'm saying so one thing is to actually make the information system more about teachers. But on the other hand, parents mostly choose schools, right? But you have both, yeah. So there might be, if you know that there are a couple of really bad teachers here, but there are also a couple of really good. So you might not be the end of the world if you end up in a school that you not necessarily want. So, yeah, you could use it in information systems as well.
Yeah, I don't have the answer to that. The only thing I think of is there must be some parallels with other professions where, a more professional system where, like the legal profession or the medical profession, where, like a sort of partnership dynamic.
Yeah.
Where teachers form partnerships.
Yeah, no, I mean that's. Oh yeah, if they call it Royal College of Teaching or Teachers, what's it called? The one that's the one's going to be established. I mean, it's the idea of a professional body. Yeah, no, absolutely. The problem is that we're talking about in medicine, best practice has become. Best practice works in a different way. I think the dangers in teaching to have too much of legal aspects is that, or not legal aspects, but the idea of sharing practices and stuff like that. There's a lot of stuff that doesn't work that they think work, unfortunately. And this is because the problem of education. You might think that you're the best teacher in the world. There's good evidence from America that head teachers don't know a good teacher. They change their mind when they find the evidence that actually the teacher is good or bad. So I'm not sure, but I mean, I have nothing against the professional association. All I'm saying is it's slightly different than in medicine, I think. Yes. So, yeah.
James.
Can you? Yeah, sorry. Use the mic for the video, I think, right?
No, I was just going to say that there was an interesting model of teacher choice just over the road at the London Nautical School, which is a state school, and the head of English there, Christopher Ward, he's a blogger, is Edutronic, and every year all the students in his school choose their own English teacher. And 95% of his students get their first choice of English teachers, which is really quite interesting. So if you wanted to look at that model, then the London Nautical School and Christopher Ward would be a good person.
Good point, very interesting. Yes, behind you. So then just pass the mic to the next guy.
Hi, Maria Ronalcera. I would like to ask a little bit about, I would put too much emphasis on competition and school choice, and not enough on raising the quality, particularly in some countries, such as in Pakistan, when the low few private schools and some private schools are only marginally better than the public school, and that's not to say much.
No, I mean
perhaps is it partly the role of the state in this terms? I know that regulation is usually the enemy, seems to be, in this case. And also another point is how much school choice, how much entry and exit can parents and children endure, because education, as you said, has so many differences in terms of, can you really make a market? How many times can you put your children through a school, making friends, etc., and then say, oh no, this is not the right school, I'm going to move into another one. Can we take these things into consideration throughout the day, please? Thank you.
Yeah, the regulation issue. So if you should regulate the market. Sorry, that's the first one? Can you repeat?
Yeah. How can we improve quality?
Okay. Yes. Okay. How can we improve quality? Well, your guess is as good as mine, because nothing works really. Most education research that is not shit crap finds very small effects. So that's another thing to put this in the light of these small to moderate effects. Most interventions don't work. And that's because we've had a system whereby we don't evaluate much of the ideas that we put into education before we roll them out. So many of the ideas that people take for granted don't work. So when you say to focus too much on competition, I just have an analogy here when it comes to, for example, collaboration. There's no evidence that collaboration works in education. No evidence at all. People say that it is, and I know that many people think that it works, and it might work, but there's no evidence that it works. When it comes to the other story, no, absolutely. I mean, that's part of why I'm discussing this, the issue of can we make the market work? Well, you might not think that we can make the market work, but I would have to say that because the evidence is positive normally, it seems to be working despite the flaws. So I'm just saying, how can you make it work better? And the point is, of course, as I said, you can't just throw out the chocolate and put in a new one. You choose a school. But you might want to, change schools once or twice, and there's coming more evidence now suggesting that changing a school is not that bad if you do it for the right reasons. So if you're searching for a better school, there seems to be evidence in America that actually can lead to positive effects. In the short run, it might be negative in some cases, but if you end up in a better school, you might actually gain from it. And the third point on that is also school choice is not only to, it takes some time before schools have a reputation based on quality, so it's not only about the children at the current situation. Of course, we can try other interventions to help them, but the next generation of children, if a bad school closes down, you will not be able to choose that bad school. So you've done them a service. Yeah. Fair enough.
I look at this as a sort of it's a very sort of deeply difficult cultural question, isn't it? So, having had a nearly 20-year career in teaching, a 15-year career in business, when you talk about markets, you're on the back foot in education. There are many teachers I've worked with who it's a positive choice to be in education for them. Very often, when you really interrogate that, they see themselves as kind of counter business, counter markets. That's what their intrinsic motivation is. So the moment you use that sort of language, and the moment you start introducing, all the sorts of ideas you've been discussing, you're really on the back foot. But so far, what I've heard is a sort of confirmation for me that if you're after improvement, if people are after improvement, in schools, it's almost wrong to think about improving schools, because the only thing that will make the difference is the quality of teaching. That's the only thing that everybody agrees on. It's not the buildings and all that. It's the teachers. So that's where, for me, the effort should be directed.
Yeah.
And their concepts and their beliefs about markets and their beliefs about competition need to be addressed and need to be handled.
Okay. Yes. Head teachers matter as well, and there are other things that matter in terms of interventions and various things for education. So teachers don't only matter, but of course, I guess we should address teachers. But when it comes to the cultural issue, well, I'm not sure that those in the functioning market, that those teachers would be teachers. We have, there are attitudinal differences between teachers when they've been educated, where they've been educated, how they've gone into teaching, etc. There might be a different types of person who enters teaching in the future. And that might be good for the kids. It might not be good for the current teachers, but it might be good for the kids. So that's an open question. And I think you're right, there is a cultural thing, but get used to it. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, man, love microphone.
Yes, do you have a, yeah, great.
John McIntosh. John McIntosh. Giving a sense of déjà vu, because I sat in this very building back in the 1980s with Arthur Selden and Max Wheeloff discussing the voucher and the future of education. A lot of water passed under the bridges since then, and I still feel that I'm fighting in the trenches today. I'm not sure how much progress we've really made. I'm just a bit concerned. I was very interested in what you were saying about markets and quasi-markets. Because the word market and voucher are bandied about in the way that schools and children are commodities and schools are sort of industries in a way. You've got seriously wrong, I think, on that, because in those days, back in the 80s, when we were discussing voucher, it wasn't simply seeing the voucher as a currency to be used in the market. There was an assumption, I suppose, around the table in those days that parents needed to be empowered. We needed to give power back to parents as the primary educators of their children, and to, in a way, protect them from state control and state regulation. I think we've lost that. We too often talk about even the voucher, but certainly education as a market in economic terms, and still make an assumption that it will be regulated from the centre. And a lot of the things that have gone wrong, I think, over the past 20, 30 years in education have been through the regulation, through the regulatory system, things like league tables, Ofsted inspections, and so on. And we've become obsessed with what philosophers might call the accidents of education rather than the substance. And so schools have focused on the outcomes of Ofsted, on league tables and so on, for their own sake, and teachers have become increasingly robotic in response to those regulations, and have really lost sight of what education is all about. I think we need to look again at how we determine what a good school is, and not simply see it in terms of those metrics which have taken control of the system. That's a statement rather than a question.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
I'm afraid.
That's fine. It's a discussion. Well, I mean, look, the CMRE also has James Tooley on its executive board, and he is a great believer in completely free education. He wants to get the state out of it. I might not agree with him on everything. I think he has some points. All I'm saying is that, and you're right, as I said, do parents value quality? What type of quality? We don't even know what we're talking about there. So there might be too much regulation. I argue because there is government funding, there will always be some regulation. How you can keep it to the optimal level, I don't know, and that's why we have to discuss this. I would challenge you, though, on the whole thing about why are these metrics important? Well, they are crucially important. Those metrics, there's a strong, some evidence, it's not the greatest so far, but that these higher scores on these tests do lead to higher economic performance at the country level, but also at the individual level. I mean, I recently just did a trivial analysis of Sweden and looking at the immigrant native gap in employment and in salaries. I mean, formal education has no bearing, but actually numeracy and literacy evaporates the entire gap.
Sorry, I don't mean metrics are not important. They are very important.
Okay.
We've got to get those metrics right.
Okay.
Let me take as an example, for a number of years, 5 GCSEs, grades A to C, were considered to be the best way of judging schools. The effect of that was to cause terrible damage to Key Stage 4 education for a lot of children in our schools, some of whom finished up with 2 GCSEs and a GNVQ in order to game the system. And so that's what I'm talking about. Absolutely. Metrics are important. First of all, we've got to get them right.
Yes.
And the metrics have got to be measuring the outcome of a good education.
Yes.
They shouldn't be an end in themselves.
Yes. I think you're right. I mean, those league tables as such, even though those were poorly designed, they have tended to have a positive effect. I think Simon Burgess is not coming here, but he has analysed those league tables, and it seems to be the case of one of the reasons why Wales is performing much worse than England. But point taken, and the government has been doing a lot of progress on the Progress 8 and various ways. Those things are also thought, but I'm actually writing this in Swedish, but we might come up with an article in English, Henrik and I, about how we can devise better metrics and information. But point taken, I agree with you on that, yeah. So last question, James, or do we have, how many more?
We can do one more, possibly two.
Possibly two, okay. Lady,
yeah. Speakers on those.
Hi, I was really interested in what you were saying around, so there's various conditions that need to hold for a market to work well, so things like bad schools closing, good schools expanding, school admissions working well, and so on. I just wondered, in the UK context, if you had to single out one thing we would need to fix for the schools market to work better, which would you focus on?
Planning laws, which is the overarching issue in most things in London and in England, planning laws. Because you can't set, I mean, even if you have for-profit schools that have incentives to start up and do decrease regulation, where are you going to set up these schools? It's very difficult. So planning laws is probably to change the supply-side dynamic. In Sweden, they set up in former offices, have a school. It's very much easier to do that. Now, there are issues with the Swedish market as well, because planning laws is very important. I would think also liberalize, I mean, if you want more supply in terms of entering, you need to have a more minimum regime in the free schools establishment process, that you have minimum requirements rather than trying to pick winners. That would be something. And when it comes to closing down, well, that's actually part of the supply. Because if you have good schools trying to set up and outcompete others, then it's easier for the pupils to migrate to those schools nearby. So we have cases in Sweden where the municipalities have strongly resisted entrance from education providers in really bad neighborhoods. I'm thinking about where they have really bad schools. They closed that down, which was a good idea after a while, but it went on for years that this was underperforming. And there was an education company wanting to go in, but they just stifled them and came up with rules of how not to get involved there and all of those things. So obviously, by liberalizing supply, you might also change the other side of the coin as well. But non-education planning laws, but education, the free school. Yeah. Okay, last question there. Yeah.
I realise that you've pointed out some of the problems with market mechanisms that become all right. Actually, can you all hear? I can manage with that.
Okay.
It seems to me, as somebody who's spent a fair amount of time educating people as well, that pupils and parents, like rivers, take the course of least resistance very often. And what I mean by that is that they will, in this results-driven world, choose the options and go for the choices which accumulate the biggest number of best grades. And I think education is not a consumer product like other consumer products, where you know what your best interests are, even perhaps as a parent and an adult. It's something that you develop over time, and you realise later that things might have been better for you than what you thought at the time. And that's a fundamental objection to the idea of consumer choice within education. In addition
but who knows the best then? Can I just ask them? Who knows better than...
Well, what I'm trying to say is that I think there is a degree of producer input which is capable of being undermined if one focuses all the time on choice and the client's desires. Going back to the point that was made about the choice of teachers within a particular school, which is in a way the logical outcome of emphasising the paramountcy of individual choice. You will be aware yourself as a Swede and the system you've described there, that the best way of getting the most number of pupils is for the teacher to give away the high grades as easily as possible.
And yet it has been positive.
And in a non-accountable system such as you described, that is going to be possible. But the effect on the individuals in terms of their education, moving away from the rigorous teacher who demands high standards and therefore becomes unpopular, is potentially quite catastrophic.
Okay. Yes, I highlighted the issues and I highlighted the problems, and yet, despite those problems, there is evidence that it worked. Although, these are difficult methodological issues. Okay, I agree. There are some issues, but I don't know. Okay. Yeah, great.